My name is Rachel Miller. At 27, I thought I had grown numb to the quiet ways my family pushed me aside until one Thursday night at 7:42 p.m., when a single email shattered whatever hope was left. You are erased from the family reunion. Don't try to come. 18 words colder than a stranger's rejection, and yet they came from my own father. For years I had carried their burdens, signed their papers, kept their empire alive, believing loyalty might one day earn me love. But that night, staring at the glow of my screen, I finally understood the truth. They had never seen me as a daughter at all. And so I typed back 2 words that would end it. Understood. Not in anger, not in defeat, but with the calm of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything left to reclaim. It was a Thursday night late enough that the streets outside my window in Detroit were already empty, but not so late that the hum of the city had gone to sleep. My apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in around you. A single lamp on the desk threw a soft yellow circle across the wood, highlighting the unopened mail and the coffee mug I hadn't washed. That was when the email came through. The notification chimed and my father's name appeared on the screen. For a second, my stomach tightened the way it always did when I saw it. I clicked, half dreading, half knowing. There it was. One sentence. You are erased from the family reunion guest list. Don't try to come. That was all. No greeting, no explanation, nothing to soften it. I stared at it not in disbelief but with a strange, still recognition. My chest didn't tighten. No tears rose to my eyes. It was as if I'd been waiting for these exact words for years, bracing myself against them long before they arrived. The words didn't knock the wind out of me. They simply landed heavy but unsurprising like a stone dropped in water. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a moment I thought maybe I should call my mother Margaret and ask if she knew, but I didn't. She had always retreated when things became messy, fading into the background with a smile and a reminder to be grateful. If she knew about this, she wouldn't have stopped it. And if she didn't, she wouldn't fight it. I leaned back in my chair, the leather squeaking softly. The room smelled faintly of old coffee grounds and detergent. Outside, a siren wailed and faded into the distance. My thoughts drifted back uninvited to all the times I'd been made invisible. I remembered being 12, hunched over a dusty desk in the garage, logging shipments of tires while my friends went to the movies. My father Richard had walked past me without a word, then stopped by Ethan, my older brother, ruffling his hair and laughing like they shared some secret. Ethan was 3 years older, reckless, charming, the son who mirrored everything my father admired in himself. I remembered being 16 spring break when everyone else went to Florida and I was stuck managing payroll at one of the satellite locations. My father didn't thank me. He didn't ask. He just assumed. And when I did the work, he acted as if nothing had happened. I remembered the quarterly meetings, sitting at the far end of the table with my carefully prepared reports, while Ethan spun stories about vision and innovation. My father nodded, eyes shining, even when those visions bled money. When I pointed out errors or raised concerns, Richard's gaze sharpened like a blade, and he told me to stop nitpicking. Focus on the bigger things, Rachel, he'd say. Bigger things apparently meant pretending problems didn't exist. The memories came in flashes, quick and sharp, filling the silence of the apartment until the single sentence on my screen felt less like a decision and more like confirmation. This was who he was. This was who I'd always been to him. An afterthought, a tool, a name to sign on a dotted line. I drew in a slow breath and reached for my phone. My hands were steady. No trembling, no hesitation. I opened a new message, typed 2 words, understood. That was it. Nothing more. I pressed send and set the phone back on the table. The screen dimmed, and for a moment the room seemed to expand with the silence. I expected to feel empty or furious or maybe broken. But what settled over me was something else entirely. Relief. A quiet stillness that made me realize he no longer held the power to shake me. I sat there in the glow of the lamp, the cursor on my laptop blinking like a heartbeat. And I realized that for the first time in years, my father's voice, sharp, clipped, commanding, had no hold on me. He had erased me, but in doing so, he'd also released me. I leaned back, let my head rest against the chair, and closed my eyes. The night outside was deep and quiet, and inside, I felt an unfamiliar calm. For once, the silence was mine. The first photograph that always caught my eye hung in my father's office at Miller Automotive Group. A black and white shot of my grandfather Samuel Grease on his hands standing proudly in front of a two-bay garage in suburban Detroit in 1978. The sign above the door read, Miller's Garage. My father loved to point at it whenever someone visited, telling the story of how his dad started with nothing but grit and a wrench. What he never admitted was how quickly he twisted that legacy into something colder. Richard Miller. My father built Miller Automotive into a regional chain of dealerships and service centers. He was 58 now, but still carried himself like a man half his age. Pressed suits shoes, shined hair, combed with precision. His mantra was carved into the culture of the company, repeated at board meetings, painted on a plaque in the lobby. We don't hire outsiders. We raise replacements. It sounded like loyalty, but really it was control. We weren't children, we were successors waiting in line. Ethan fit the role my father imagined perfectly. At 31, my brother had the smile, the handshake, the knack for slipping into a room and leaving everyone charmed. He loved nightclubs, fast cars, and Instagram posts of rooftop bars. Richard didn't see irresponsibility. He saw reflections of himself in his prime. Ethan was his golden child, untouchable, no matter how often he stumbled. Then there was my mother, Margaret. 55, soft-spoken, always well put together. She was the one who filled the space between storms. She played hostess at corporate dinners, folded invoices into envelopes when my father needed busy work done, smiled when things got tense, and afterward pulled me aside to whisper, "Be patient, sweetheart. Your father is building something for all of us." It wasn't malice. It was surrender. She didn't want to fight, so she pretended there wasn't one. And me, Rachel, from the time I was old enough to hold a pen, I was handed responsibilities that didn't belong to a child. At 12, I spent spring afternoons in the garage office, hunched over QuickBooks, logging shipments of tires and parts. At 16, when my friends were driving down to Florida for spring break, I was in a back office, calculating payroll for 3 different locations, eating cold pizza off paper plates, while the fluorescent lights buzzed above me. I didn't choose those jobs. They were laid at my feet with the same inevitability as taking out the trash. I can still see it clearly. Ethan bursting into the office one Friday night, smelling like expensive cologne, tossing his car keys on the desk with a grin. "Dad says we're heading out to the lake house this weekend," he announced already halfway out the door. I looked up from the stack of paychecks I was double-checking and asked, "Shouldn't you help close out the vendor invoices first?" He laughed. "That's your thing, sis. You've got the numbers. I've got the vision." My father appeared in the doorway just in time to hear it. Instead of correcting Ethan, he smiled proudly. "He's right, Rachel. He sees the bigger picture." I clenched my jaw, staring at the papers in front of me, not trusting myself to speak. The numbers were my burden. The glory was his. That was the pattern, and it never broke. Family dinners were no different. Richard sat at the head of the table, Ethan to his right, recounting wild stories of networking at golf clubs and business lunches that sounded more like excuses to drink on company time. My father roared with laughter, raising his glass. When I spoke, when I mentioned that we could cut costs by renegotiating our fleet leases or that one of our vendors was overbilling us, Richard waved his hand like swatting at a fly. "Rachel, stop focusing on the weeds. Let Ethan tell us about the future." My mother refilled glasses, laid out dessert, and murmured, "Your father means well. Don't take it personally." But how could I not? Every dismissal carved a little deeper into the quiet place inside me where I stored all the words I never said. One night after a quarterly meeting, I stayed late in the office, flipping through receipts under the dim light of the desk lamp. Ethan had left hours earlier for some party. Richard had gone home, and it was just me and the silence of the building. I ran my fingers over the old photograph of Grandpa Samuel still hanging on the wall. He'd been a mechanic, a man who valued hard work, not politics. I wondered what he'd think if he saw how his son had turned a garage built on sweat into a kingdom built on hierarchy. I whispered to the photo, "I'm not invisible. I'm not." The words felt strange on my tongue, like they didn't belong to me yet. Then I heard my father's voice in memory, sharp and clear. "We don't hire outsiders. We raise replacements." The irony bit at me. He had raised replacements, all right. But only one of us was treated like one. Ethan was the heir. I was the spare. That night, sitting alone in the office, I realized something that lodged in me like a splinter. No matter how much I carried, no matter how much I sacrificed, my father would never look at me the way he looked at Ethan. And that understanding, quiet and bitter, settled into me with a weight I would carry into every choice that followed. When I think about the version of myself that might have been, I always go back to the spring I finished my MBA at Stanford. I had an offer letter from a major logistics firm in Chicago, the kind of job that promised a six-figure starting salary, stock options, and a clear path to independence. I remember sitting in my apartment in Palo Alto, the letter printed and folded on the table, running my fingers over the company logo. It felt like the door to a life I had built for myself, brick by brick, finally opening. I called my father to tell him. His voice over the phone was flat, almost impatient. "Chicago. That's a waste, Rachel. We need you here in Detroit." I tried to explain, "Dad, this isn't just a job. It's the chance to build my own career. They sought me out. It's not something I can just pass up." There was a pause, then his reply, cold and final. "Family before ambition. Always. Your grandfather built this company for us. You don't walk away from that. You come home." I sat there staring at the wall, the weight of his words settling in. I knew deep down it wasn't really a request. It was an order dressed up as duty. When I flew home that summer, Ethan was already being introduced at company events as the future of Miller Automotive. He stood beside my father at ribbon cuttings, his arm draped casually over Richard's shoulder, champagne in his hand, promising bold expansion and fresh ideas. People clapped, cameras flashed, and I stood off to the side holding a clipboard, making sure the caterers showed up on time. Ethan's vision rarely went beyond buzzwords, but no one seemed to notice. My father spoke about him like he was a prodigy. "Ethan understands the bigger picture," he told the board. "Rachel's good with the details, but Ethan has the vision." It didn't matter that Ethan blew through budgets or that I was the one who kept projects from collapsing. My father wanted a mirror, and Ethan was polished enough to reflect him. In 2021, the company announced plans to build a new regional headquarters in downtown Detroit. It was ambitious. 3 stories of glass and steel, a showroom, offices, and service bays that would anchor Miller Automotive's next phase. The project came with a $3 million expansion loan. I remember the day Richard called me into his office. The blinds were half-drawn light slicing across the old photograph of my grandfather on the wall. Richard sat behind his desk, papers, neatly stacked, a pen lying uncapped. Ethan lounged in the chair to the side, scrolling on his phone. Richard didn't waste time. He slid a folder across the desk toward me. "The bank needs a cosigner," he said. "Your credit is spotless. With your MBA, you're the natural choice." I opened the folder, scanned the loan documents, my name typed neatly on the line below his. My heart thudded. "You're asking me to put my name on $3 million, I said slowly. Richard leaned back, clasped his hands, and gave me a look I'd seen my whole life. The one that said, "This isn't up for debate. We're not asking Rachel. You're part of this family. This is your responsibility." I glanced at Ethan. He smirked, shrugged like it was nothing. "Come on, sis. It's just paperwork. Dad and I have the vision. You just make it official. For a moment I thought about saying no, about walking out calling the firm in Chicago telling them I was ready. But my mother's voice echoed in my head. Your father is building something for us. Be grateful, sweetheart. And I knew if I refused I'd be branded disloyal and outsider in my own family. I picked up the pen. The weight of it felt enormous, heavier than the loan itself. I signed my name on the line, each letter a surrender. No applause, no thank you. Richard simply closed the folder, capped the pen, and moved on to the next topic as though I had signed for a package delivery. Ethan pocketed his phone and said, "Perfect. Let's celebrate tonight." But I didn't feel like celebrating. I walked out of that office, the echo of my footsteps in the hallway sounding louder than they should have. Outside, the sky over Detroit was gray heavy with late summer clouds. I stood on the steps of the building clutching my bag, and for the first time it hit me. My freedom had just been traded away with a stroke of ink. I had chosen family over ambition. Or maybe family had chosen for me. Either way, something inside me felt smaller, dimmer. My future was no longer my own. It belonged to Miller Automotive, to Richard, to Ethan, to a legacy that had never once asked me what I wanted. That night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I told myself I had done the right thing. That loyalty would be rewarded, that being indispensable meant one day I'd be seen valued. But deep down, beneath the layers of rationalizing, I felt it. The quiet truth. With that signature, a part of me had been erased. The quarterly budget meeting was supposed to be routine, just me, my father, and Ethan sitting around the long oak table in the conference room at Miller Automotive's headquarters downtown. The blinds were half closed against the winter light, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee. I had my spreadsheets open, numbers neatly lined up, every cell checked twice. Halfway down the vendor report, something caught my eye. A $15,000 invoice for fleet maintenance. At first glance it looked ordinary, but then I flipped back through the past months. The same invoice, identical amounts, identical vendor ID, repeated 3 times. My pulse ticked faster. I slid the page forward. This invoice has been submitted every month for the past quarter, I said. It's a duplicate. We're paying the same amount over and over. Ethan leaned back in his chair, arms folded, a smirk tugging at his mouth. That's from a friend of mine. He cuts us deals on other contracts. Let it slide. I stared at him. Let it slide. That's $45,000. This isn't pocket change. He shrugged, dismissive. You worry too much, Rachel. Not everything has to be about the math. I turned to my father, waiting for him to step in to at least question it. Richard didn't even look at the invoice. He picked up his coffee, took a sip, and said, "Focus on the bigger picture. Stop acting like an outsider." The words landed like a slap. Outsider. After everything. After signing away my freedom on that $3 million loan, after holding this company together through supply chain shortages, payroll crises, late-night vendor calls, I was still nothing more than an outsider. Heat climbed into my face. I'm not an outsider. I'm the one keeping this company from sinking under your so-called vision. Richard's eyes flicked to me, sharp and cold. Enough. The meeting moved on as if my protest hadn't happened. Ethan joked about a new marketing campaign. My father laughed, pleased. I sat there in silence, gripping the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles whitened. When the meeting ended, I went back to my office, logged into the system to pull more data, and found my access restricted. Vendor platforms I used daily now asked for permissions I no longer had. When I asked it, they told me it was a restructuring order from above. A week later, the company credit card tied to my name expired. When I asked about a replacement, the finance department brushed me off. Temporary system changes, they said. But I saw Ethan with a new standing desk in his office, a brand new MacBook, and the company footing the bill for a leadership retreat in Las Vegas. I passed his office one afternoon and heard him laughing on the phone. Yeah, Vegas was incredible, all comped by the company. You should have seen the suite. His voice was loud, carefree, while my own requests for a working credit card went unanswered. Walking back to my desk, I felt it with clarity. They weren't just ignoring me. They were phasing me out. Quietly, deliberately, like closing doors one by one, until I was sealed in a room with no exits. I sat down, opened my laptop, and stared at the login screen that now blocked half the systems I used to run. My reflection looked back at me in the dark monitor, tired eyes, jaw tight. For the first time, the anger didn't just sting. It settled deep, solidifying into something else, an alertness, a warning. They were preparing a door for me, and it only opened one way. I clicked open a blank folder on my desktop, renamed it in plain letters, Shadow Ledger. One by one, I started saving copies of every invoice, every email, every note that showed where the money went, who signed what, and how often Ethan's name came up in expenses that didn't make sense. The sound of the copier down the hall hummed faintly. Ethan's laughter drifted from behind his door, and I kept typing, each keystroke a promise. I wasn't going to be erased quietly. Not this time. Every month, like clockwork, I pulled my personal credit report. It had become a habit, the kind of routine check you do when you've spent years being the reliable one, the name people lean on. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, scrolling through the usual lines, my student loans now fully paid, my car lease, a credit card with a modest balance I paid off each month. Everything was clean as always. But then midway down, a line stopped me cold. Miller Automotive Expansion Loan, $3,000, co-signer Rachel Miller, status delinquent, 90 days past due. I blinked, convinced I had misread it. 90 days past due. My name attached to it. Yet my score hadn't plummeted. The note beside it read, extended grace period due to primary applicant's co-signer reliability. They weren't paying. And the only reason the bank hadn't lowered the hammer yet was because my credit was spotless. My stomach turned. I pushed back from the table, pacing the small kitchen. I had signed the loan, yes, but I hadn't been shown a financial statement in months. My access to the books had been cut off. Ethan brushed me off whenever I asked. Don't worry about it, sis. Big things coming. Now I could see the truth. Those big things were smoke and mirrors, and I was the shield keeping creditors from noticing. I logged into the vendor system with the limited access I still had, pulling up archived files I'd secretly copied before they shut me out. Hours slipped by as I clicked through invoices. The numbers didn't add up. One line read, Marketing Testing Campaign, $50,000. I opened the supporting documents. No ads, no reports, nothing to justify it. Just a PDF invoice signed R. Miller. Except it wasn't my father's handwriting. It was mine. Or at least someone's version of it. A shaky copy of my signature. I felt my chest tighten. I scrolled further. 3 separate charges for fleet repairs, each billed at nearly identical amounts within weeks of each other, all marked approved by Rachel Miller. I hadn't touched those files. I hadn't signed anything. I pulled up the scanned signatures. The loops, the slant, even the way the R curved. It looked close enough to fool an outsider. But I knew my own handwriting. I knew what I had and hadn't signed. Someone had been using my name to push through expenses that didn't exist. My hands shook as I printed copies, sliding them into a folder. The hum of the printer filled the silence of my apartment. Page after page of proof that I was being used not just as a co-signer, but as a mask for fraud. I sat back down at the table, staring at the pile. My reflection caught in the dark window behind the screen. A daughter erased from her family, but still convenient enough to forge when it suited them. The anger that rose wasn't sharp anymore. It was heavier, quieter, like a weight settling in my bones. They hadn't just cut me out. They were exploiting me, risking my future to keep their empire afloat. For years I had told myself that if I worked hard enough, if I proved loyal enough, eventually my father would see me, acknowledge me. Let me step fully into the company I'd sacrificed for. But staring at those falsified invoices that hope finally broke, this wasn't about fairness anymore. It wasn't about recognition or even belonging. It was survival. I gathered the papers into the folder, labeled it in bold black marker, Shadow Ledger. Then I slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk and locked it. As I turned the key, I knew with a clarity that stole my breath. If I didn't find a way out, I would go down with them. I closed the laptop, the screen going dark, leaving me with my reflection once again. For the first time, I didn't see the dutiful daughter who wanted to be included. I saw someone cornered someone who finally understood there was only one choice left. I had to protect myself, even if it meant burning the bridge they'd already set on fire. I took the early train into Chicago, the February sky outside the window, a dull sheet of gray. My folder sat heavy in my bag, the papers inside neatly clipped, each one a reminder of how far the Miller name had pulled me down. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. It felt like crossing enemy lines. The cafe was tucked on a quiet corner near the courthouse, the kind of place lawyers ducked into between hearings. Dark wood tables, a low hum of conversation, the smell of burnt espresso hanging in the air. Danielle Harris was already there waiting for me at a booth by the window. She looked up, smiled faintly, and slid a mug of coffee toward me. "It's been years," she said. I sat down across from her, my throat tight. Too many. Danielle had been in my business law seminar back at Stanford. We'd lost touch after graduation, but I knew she'd gone into corporate and family law here. She was someone I could trust, and trust was a rare currency these days. I pulled the folder from my bag, laid it on the table between us. "I need you to look at these." She flipped through slowly, her lawyer's eyes scanning every line, her brow knitting tighter with each page. Invoices, bank statements, the co-signed loan agreement with my name typed neatly on the line. When she got to the forged signatures, she tapped her nail against the page. "This isn't yours." I shook my head. "Not even close." She leaned back, lips pressed together. "Rachel, this is serious. Fraud, misrepresentation, misuse of funds. But here's what matters. You're not listed as a guarantor. You co-signed, yes, but legally if you withdraw before restructuring, you're not liable for the fallout." The words hit me like air after drowning. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady myself. "You mean I can get out?" Danielle's voice softened. "Yes. If you act now and if you're careful." For the first time in months, the pressure in my chest loosened. My eyes stung, and before I could stop them, tears welled. I brushed them away quickly, embarrassed. I didn't think there was any way out. Danielle reached across the table, her hand firm over mine. "You don't need to scream. You just need to move the brick holding up their wall. Let it fall on its own." I sat there, the words circling in my head. Not scream, not beg, just act. Later that evening, I met Sabrina Lee at her apartment in Lincoln Park. She'd been my closest friend in undergrad, now a financial advisor with a reputation for cutting through nonsense. When she opened the door, she hugged me tight. "You look exhausted," she said, pulling me inside. I laughed weakly. That's one way to put it. We sat at her kitchen table while I spread the papers out again. She adjusted her glasses, scanning the documents with the precision I remembered from the nights we crammed for exams together. "Here's the good news," she said finally. "Your personal assets are untouched. You've kept your savings in a trust. Your credit cards are clean, your investments are separate. They used your name, but they can't touch what's actually yours. Not unless you let them." The knot in my stomach loosened another notch. "So I'm not ruined." She shook her head firmly. "No, but they will be if you stop propping them up." I leaned back in the chair, the sound of her words sinking deep. They depended on me. Not just my labor, not just my silence, but my spotless record. Without it, the house of cards collapsed. We sat in silence for a long moment, the city lights flickering through the window. Finally, Sabrina looked at me and said, "So, what are you going to do?" I stared at the papers spread across her table. The forged signatures, the inflated invoices, the loan agreement with my name staring back. For years, I'd been trying to earn a seat at their table. Now I realized I didn't want one. I wanted the table gone. The three of us, Danielle, Sabrina, and I, met again 2 nights later in a quiet diner just off Michigan Avenue. The waitress poured coffee, the clink of cups covering our whispers. Danielle laid out the legal steps, her voice calm and precise. File the withdrawal paperwork with the bank, send notice to the loan officer, and document every irregularity you've uncovered. Don't confront them directly. Don't warn them. Just file and let the system move. Sabrina chimed in with the financial strategy. Move your liquid assets into accounts they can't reach. Keep your trust tight. Make sure no joint accounts exist, not even a single one. I listened, scribbling notes, my pen shaking slightly. The plan felt surreal, like standing on the edge of a cliff and knowing the jump was the only way forward. Danielle's eyes met mine. Rachel, this isn't about revenge. It's about survival. About reclaiming what's yours. I nodded slowly. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just reacting. I was planning. As we left the diner, the cold Chicago wind whipped down the street, sharp enough to sting my skin. I pulled my coat tighter, the folder of documents heavy under my arm. Danielle's words echoed again, steady and undeniable. You don't need to scream. Just move the brick and the wall will fall. I walked toward the station with that sentence anchored in me, each step firmer than the last. For the first time, the path forward was mine alone. I closed the blinds in my apartment and set my phone on silent. The folder Danielle had helped me draft sat open on the desk, papers neatly stacked, the withdrawal letter signed in black ink. My laptop glowed in the dim room waiting. I typed in the old administrator credentials, the ones I had created back when I still had full access to Miller Automotive's systems. My pulse hammered as the screen flickered, then loaded. I half expected a denied message, but instead the dashboard appeared sluggish but alive. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly, each second stretching long. I scrolled through the menus until I found it, Loan Management Portal. I clicked the page loading in jerky increments. My palms were damp. On the right side of the screen, under my name, was a small link. Remove cosigner. I hovered the cursor there, my finger trembling just slightly on the trackpad. My father's voice echoed in my head. Family before ambition. My brother's smirk. It's just paperwork, sis. And then Danielle's steady tone. You don't need to scream. Just move the brick. I clicked. A form opened asking for documentation. I attached the PDF of the withdrawal letter Danielle and I had finalized. The system prompted for my PIN. I entered it carefully, one digit at a time. The screen froze for a breath, then displayed update received. Processing pending compliance review. I exhaled long, and shaky, my shoulders sagging as if I'd been holding my breath for years. It was done. For a moment, I just sat there staring at the words. Then instinct pushed me forward. I opened my email, drafted a message to Keith Thompson, the bank's loan officer I'd negotiated with during the expansion. Subject, urgent, Miller. Automotive expansion loan. I typed quickly, attaching the documents I had collected, vendor invoices with forged signatures, inflated consulting fees, copies of payments routed through Ethan's contacts. I kept my language professional, precise. Please note my formal withdrawal as cosigner. Attached are records indicating financial discrepancies and possible fraudulent activity. I request an internal review at your earliest convenience. I hit send. The cursor blinked at me, ordinary and calm. My heart pounded against my ribs, then slowly the rhythm eased. I pushed back from the desk, stood, and paced the room. My legs were restless, my hands tingling. For months I had been cornered, trapped under the weight of their control. And now with a few clicks I had stepped out of their shadow. I walked to the window and pulled back the blinds. The city lights stretched across the horizon, Detroit glowing in patches of orange and white. A car horn echoed faintly below. The night air seeped through the glass, cool and clean. My chest felt lighter. I poured a glass of water, sat back down, and let the silence wrap around me. There were no raised voices, no dismissive waves of my father's hand, no mocking smirk from Ethan. Just me, the hum of my laptop, and the knowledge that I had done something they never imagined I could. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I wasn't begging to belong. I had cut the rope they had tied around me, and for the first time I felt the slack in my own hands. The email was gone, the withdrawal filed, and somewhere in the system a clock had started ticking. I closed the laptop gently, the sound of the hinge soft in the stillness. My heartbeat finally slowed, the quiet settling into something that felt almost like peace. The vibration of my phone woke me before dawn, a sharp, insistent buzz against the nightstand. At first I thought it was my alarm, but when I rolled over and squinted at the screen, I saw the number of missed calls stacked higher than I'd ever seen. 32, all from familiar numbers. My father, Ethan, the office landline at Miller Automotive. I set the phone back down, turned over and pulled the blanket tighter. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to answer. But the buzzing didn't stop. It rang again, then again. By mid-morning, the missed calls climbed past 78. My voicemail box filled until the icon blinked red. I poured myself coffee, the bitter steam curling into the quiet kitchen, and finally put the phone on speaker. The first voicemail was from Gordon Adams, our longtime chief accountant. His voice was thin, cracking around the edges. "Rachel, call me back right now. The loan is collapsing. The bank pulled support. We need your signature to stabilize this. If you don't step in, we're at risk of default. You have to fix this." His words tripped over each other, more pleading than professional. I deleted it without listening again. The next was Ethan. His tone was sharp, angry, but trying to sound calm. "What the hell did you do? We could have handled this internally. Now you've made it worse. Stop being dramatic and call me back. We're family." I laughed under my breath, the sound surprising even me. Family. That word had been used as both weapon and leash for so long it barely meant anything now. The following message came from my mother, Margaret. Her voice trembled, wet with tears. "Sweetheart, please, your father says the bank froze everything. Payroll's in jeopardy. Did you sign something? Tell me you didn't." There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath. "Rachel, talk to me. Please." I held the phone in my hand, listening to the silence that followed her plea. I wanted to picture her as an innocent caught in the storm, but I knew better. She had always looked the other way when my father pushed me aside, when Ethan mocked me, when I was loaded down with responsibilities that weren't mine. She had chosen silence, and silence had its consequences. The phone rang again, her name flashing across the screen. This time I answered, "Rachel." Her voice broke as soon as I said hello. "Oh, thank God. Tell me it isn't true. Tell me you didn't do what your father says you did." I stood at the window looking out at the gray sprawl of the city. "I removed my name," I said evenly. "That's all." She gasped, a sound like glass cracking. "But you can't just do that." "You know what this means?" "I know exactly what it means," I said. My voice was steady, colder than I intended. "It means I'm not your shield anymore." For a long moment she said nothing. I could hear her breathing shaky and shallow. Then she whispered, "Rachel, this affects all of us." "No," I corrected softly. "You all made sure it didn't." The silence that followed was heavy, a silence where every unsaid truth lived. I hung up first. I set the phone on the counter, watching it light up again and again, the names flashing across the screen like ghosts. Richard, Ethan, even Gordon. I didn't answer. The kettle whistled on the stove. I poured another cup of coffee, sat down at the table, and opened the folder labeled Shadow Ledger. The papers lay spread in front of me, the proof of everything they had done, every forged signature, every siphoned dollar. For once, the weight of it didn't feel crushing. It felt like armor. The calls kept coming, the buzzing endless, but the sound no longer pierced me. It was background noise, nothing more. They had built their empire on the assumption I would never say no, that I would carry the weight quietly forever. Now they were the ones cornered, not me. By late afternoon, the phone finally went still, its screen dark. The apartment sank into quiet, and I realized I wasn't bracing for the next demand anymore. The strings they had tied around me were cut one by one. I leaned back in the chair, the folder still open, and let the stillness settle. For the first time, their desperation wasn't mine to solve. It was theirs to drown in. Leona's used to mean birthdays balloons and the kind of laughter that rose loud enough to embarrass the waitstaff. Now the brick walls and low lights only deepened the chill. The private dining room near the fireplace, once crowded with cakes and candles, was stripped bare. No decorations, no warmth, just a table set for 4. 3 seats filled, one left empty. Mine. Richard sat rigid at the head, his suit pressed jaw tight, eyes trained on the door. Ethan lounged to his right, scrolling on his phone like the whole thing was beneath him. My mother. Margaret sat on the other side, her hands folded in her lap, knuckles white against each other. I let them wait 15 minutes before I walked in. The sound of my heels on the wood floor echoed against the walls. All 3 heads lifted. For a moment, the room held its breath. I wore gray slacks, a button-down blouse, neutral, unreadable, the kind of armor you put on when you know they'll look for cracks. I set my bag down, pulled out the sealed envelope and placed it in the center of the table before taking the empty chair. Richard spoke first, voice low, controlled. "You made your point." Ethan snorted. "Yeah, congratulations, you're destroying us over ego. You think you've won something?" I looked at him calmly. His cheeks were flushed, his cufflinks gleaming under the light. The golden sun still convinced charm could erase numbers. My mother shifted her eyes, wet hands trembling under the table. She whispered, "Rachel," but her voice trailed off into nothing. I slid the envelope toward Richard. "This is a signed affidavit confirming my permanent withdrawal from the loan, the board, and every business operation tied to Miller Automotive. You will never use my name again." Richard's jaw clenched. "You don't understand what you're doing. You're punishing the legacy your grandfather built." I held his gaze. "Grandpa built a garage. You turned it into a dictatorship." Ethan leaned forward, sneering. "You've always wanted credit you didn't earn. We gave you everything. A job, a place at the table. And this is how you repay us." I felt the steadiness inside me, the clarity that had sharpened since the night I pressed send on that email. My voice didn't rise, didn't crack. "You erased me from the family, but I erased my name from your empire." The words landed heavy. For the first time in my life, Richard flinched. His hands pressed flat against the table, then tightened into fists. He tried to mask it, but I saw it. The crack in his authority. "Rachel, please." His voice broke, not loud but fragile, a plea instead of a command. The sound of it startled even him. I stood slowly, pushing my chair back. "You said I was erased. I'm just agreeing with you." The silence that followed pressed against the walls. My mother's breath hitched her hands, trembling harder. Ethan scoffed, muttering something under his breath, but the bravado in his voice rang hollow. Richard sat, frozen shoulders hunched, the plea still hanging between us. I picked up my bag, straightened my blouse, and turned for the door. The room behind me stayed hushed, their voices trapped under the weight of what had just been said. For the first time, I walked out not as their daughter, not as their shield, not as their scapegoat, but as someone who had finally closed the door they had been preparing for me all along. The headline hit the stands 2 mornings later. Detroit News ran it above the fold: "Miller Automotive faces financial crisis amid family disputes." Below it was a photograph of Richard, Ethan, and me taken years earlier at a company ribbon cutting. Richard beamed, Ethan's hand raised in a half-wave, and me, standing slightly behind them holding a clipboard almost cropped out of the frame. Now the same image was being used to illustrate the unraveling of everything they thought untouchable. By noon, the article had spread across local radio and TV stations. Neighbors whispered in grocery store aisles, former classmates messaged me links, and even the cashier at the corner market raised an eyebrow when she rang up my coffee. "You're related to them, aren't you?" she asked softly, glancing at the paper on the counter. I just nodded, slid cash across the counter, and walked out into the cold. Inside the company, chaos erupted. Employees texted me frantically, some begging for clarity, others venting years of frustration. "No one knows what's happening," one wrote. "Payroll might bounce. Vendors are calling nonstop." Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. The message was short from Mark Stevens, the warehouse manager who had been with Miller Automotive longer than I had been alive. Thank you for standing up. We all knew the truth. None of us could say it, but you did. I stared at the words for a long time, my throat tight. For years I had felt like I was screaming into a void, every warning dismissed as nitpicking, every contribution erased. Now the same people who once watched in silence were acknowledging it. At the dealership downtown, customers walked past glass doors with uncertainty. Reporters gathered in the parking lot, microphones ready. Richard shut himself in his office, avoiding questions. Ethan stormed through the hallways, snapping at staff, his voice carrying. This is temporary. Don't believe everything you read. But the truth was visible in their faces. The mechanics whispering over tool benches, the sales team pretending to make calls, the receptionist twisting her pen nervously at the front desk. Everyone felt the ground shifting. That evening, I walked past one of the dealerships, the lot nearly empty. Cars that should have been showcased gleamed under dim lights, ignored. I paused on the sidewalk, watching through the glass as Mark crossed the showroom floor, clipboard in hand. He spotted me outside, raised his eyes for a second, and gave the smallest nod. A gesture of solidarity. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. The building itself felt hollow, a shell echoing with years of arrogance. My father's mantra. We don't hire outsiders. We raise replacements, was etched on a plaque in the lobby. Now it looked like a tombstone. Back at home, I laid Mark's message on the table, written out in my notebook. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the people who had carried this company for decades while being treated like parts of a machine. It was about the lies dressed as vision, the favoritism disguised as leadership. For the first time, I felt something more than relief. I felt justice moving outward, rippling beyond me. What I had done wasn't just survival. It had given others permission to acknowledge the truth, to stop pretending. As night settled over the city, I closed the blinds and sat in the quiet of my apartment, the newspaper folded beside me. The story was out now, no longer mine to protect or to hide. The collapse had begun, and with it came a strange kind of freedom, not just for me, but for everyone who had lived under their shadow. The first morning I woke up in Seattle, the light poured through tall windows that stretched nearly floor to ceiling. The city was alive outside. Buses rumbling along Pike Street, seagulls circling from the waterfront, the faint hum of traffic rolling off the freeway. But inside the loft it was quiet, and the quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was the kind that let me breathe. Boxes were stacked against the exposed brick wall, only half unpacked. My coffee maker sat on the counter next to a single mug, the smell drifting into the wide open space. I carried the cup to the window, leaned against the frame, and watched as people hurried down the sidewalks below umbrellas bobbing in the mist. For the first time, their pace didn't make me feel behind. I wasn't chasing anything. Within weeks, I found work consulting with women-led startups across the city. A founder named Elena invited me to help restructure her small design firm after a messy fallout with her investors. I sat across from her in a co-working space, reviewing spreadsheets, highlighting inefficiencies, suggesting contracts that protected her ownership. She watched me with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "No one's ever explained it this way," she said. "I thought I was going to lose everything." I smiled. "You're not going to lose it. You're going to grow it. But you're going to do it on your terms." Word spread quietly. One client led to another. A bakery in Ballard, a boutique marketing company in Capitol Hill, a tech startup run by two sisters in Fremont. Each one carried a story not unlike mine. Women working twice as hard, twice as invisibly until someone tried to push them out. Helping them wasn't charity. It was survival passed forward. At night, the loft filled with the glow of the city. I'd sit at the small wooden table I'd bought from a second-hand shop, papers, spread out my laptop, open wine glass at my side. The hum of Seattle was a soundtrack through the windows. Ferries honking laughter echoing up from bars, the low rhythm of a city that kept moving no matter what. Sometimes I caught myself comparing that sound to Detroit, where silence had been used as punishment as exile. Here, silence was a choice. I pinned a single photograph above my desk, a picture of me at 25 standing awkwardly at a company event half hidden behind a Miller Automotive banner. The image reminded me not of failure, but of erasure. How easily I'd been cut out, how willingly I'd stayed quiet. Now it hung above the desk, where I made my own choices in my own city on my own terms. When I finished my work for the night, I'd step onto the small balcony with a blanket draped over my shoulders, the damp air cool against my skin. The skyline shimmered, the Space Needle lit like a beacon in the distance. I'd raise the glass of wine to the view, the words forming in my chest like an oath. I am finally visible. The thought wasn't loud, but it was steady, and it settled deeper each night, until it became less a declaration and more a truth. In Detroit, I had been erased. In Seattle, I was writing again. Not reports for someone else's empire, not invoices to cover someone else's fraud, but pages that belonged entirely to me. And with every sip, every contract signed, every life I helped steady, the erasure faded, replaced by something unshakable: freedom. I set the glass down, the city's lights dancing across its surface, and let the night fold around me. A week later, an envelope slid through the mail slot, thin and official. My name was typed neatly on the front, the return address stamped with the Wells Fargo logo. I carried it to the kitchen table, set it down beside my mug of coffee, and stared at it for a long moment. The paper tore easily beneath my fingers. Inside was a single page, the kind of dry corporate letter that normally meant nothing. But this one meant everything. This letter confirms that Rachel Miller has formally withdrawn as co-signer from the Miller Automotive Expansion Loan. No further obligation remains. That was it. No flourish, no apology, no acknowledgement of the weight it carried. Just a line in black ink that closed years of silence and servitude. I folded it once, slid it into the binder where I kept all my personal documents. On the front of the binder, written in plain block letters, was the word complete. I set it back into the drawer, shut it gently, and let the finality of it sink in. The loft was quiet, except for the faint hum of traffic below. I walked to the window, pressing my palm against the cool glass. Seattle stretched out in front of me, the skyline glittering against the night. The Space Needle glowed like a sentinel fairies cut lines of light across the water, and the city seemed alive with possibility. I thought of the garage photo still hanging in my father's office, of Richard's rigid jaw, of Ethan's careless grin, of Margaret's trembling silence. I thought of every time I had been told to be grateful, to be patient, to be quiet. And then I thought of this moment. Standing alone in my loft with no strings tied to me, no ledger balanced on my shoulders, no voice calling me outsider. They had tried to erase me. They had written me out of family dinners, board meetings, loan documents, life itself. But what they hadn't expected was that erasure can become a canvas. That in the space they cleared, I would write something stronger. I lifted the glass of wine on the windowsill, the city lights scattering through it, and let the words form steady and clear. They tried to erase me from their family. I built not revenge, but reality. The bitterness was gone now. What remained was truth. I took a slow sip, set the glass down, and allowed the quiet to settle, no longer heavy but earned. My life was mine. And if you've ever had to reclaim your place in life, share your story below. Because sometimes the act of telling it is the proof that you were never invisible at all.